Hi, Gopo kids. Welcome back. It's Mrs. Thorson again. We're going to finish up chapter 16 today, talking about how consolidation of the news media has impacted how news is delivered and then bias that we see in the news. So basically, the news has changed a lot in the recent decades. One of the ways it has is because of government regulation over the airways. So the FCC won't let me be me, so let me see. Sorry, got a little Eminem going for you. I get very distracted every time I see that the FCC. So they did oversee what was on the radio. Now they're trying to see what's on TV. But there has been deregulation. They've allowed the news media to do more of their own stuff on their own. And because of that, we see that a lot of them have consolidated in order to maximize their profits. So because of this media consolidation, where there's a concentration of ownership in a few corporations, it's very similar for my ApeCon kids to an oligopoly. We see that now there's very few sources to go to watch the news. But the roles of the FCC was meant to prevent this. It didn't necessarily do this. And there was an act concerning this in 1996, the Telecommunication Acts, which raised a percentage of a national audience of a corporation could hold, which was basically saying they could only get so much viewership, which was hard because it gave less control to local stations and there's fewer owners, which is less voices and less voices for us to hear over the airways and less choices for us to have too. As you can see, these are basically, as of 2011, there's basically about 5 major networks that have that basically control the media. So the idea is, should the government regulate this to ensure equal treatment of candidates, or should they allow capitalism to roam freely? That's kind of up to you. Next, we're going to see how the media shapes politics today, if there's bias and stuff. So here's the deal. There's a lot of changes to the media too that have given more freedom to us, but at the same time, there's consequences with that. So for instance, one of the things is known as citizen journalism, where basically it's the idea that since every person has a cell phone, they can pretty much tape anything and be journalists and get their information out on the internet. This has actually become a major source of political news. Probably a more recent example in 2020 was citizens videotaping the arrest of George Floyd. And that's an example. Like anytime you hear about a news story, a lot of times it's basically regular citizens like you and me with their cell phones out taping what's happening. Recording, excuse me. Sorry, I'm going back. And because of this too, we see citizens getting involved. We also see the news outlet being more infotainment, where they are giving info, but are doing it in an entertaining outlet. And it definitely increases viewership, which is good for these companies, but it does decrease support and faith in the government because a lot of times when they infotain, it's a lot of attacks on the government. So here's a polling thing that talks about, it's looking at different generational gaps on who their main source of news is. As you can see, millennials tend to get their news from Facebook, whereas baby boomers, the older generation, tends to get their news from local TV. So there's a gap too, because obviously local news is definitely more just objective, and Facebook is absolutely not objective. Here's another thing. We're talking about bias in the media. There was questions asked of Americans if they think there's bias in the media, which is just basically like when you see one news station or one journalist lean one way or another. And you can see that over time, since the 80s, the plurality of people think there's either a great deal of it or a fair amount. So like most people, so 67% of Americans think there is definitely bias in the media. So how do the media shape campaigns and elections? They definitely focus more on polling rather than focusing on the issues. So this is known as horse race journalism, where they basically follow the polls and see where everything's going, and it's more of the drama of it rather than focusing on the issues. So this really does, how does this influence American voters? It leads them to vote not necessarily on like substantive issues, like actual policy issues, but more of like, ooh, this is exciting, following the race. And this is how it is. It's to give you an example of why it's called horse race journalism. It's basically when you watch the TV and you're like, oh, and they're off. And you could see that Biden is leading in Florida by 4%. But if you look up in Pennsylvania, he's closing his lead. You know, he was leading by 8%. Now he's only leading by 3%. But then we go all the way over to Arizona and it's a close race there. It's too close to call. That's horse race journalism, rather than seeing the news media be like, okay, tonight we're going to take the first half hour to talk about what Biden believes on the issues and the second half hour to talk about what Trump believes on the issues, so that you can be a more educated voter. They don't really focus on that because they want to maximize their profits, and that's not entertaining. So basically when it comes to news today, we also see that people are divided by getting their news media from online, and it has caused party polarization. So it may help more people connect with news sources, which is good because a lot of people are getting their more news. They have there's more variety to get their news, but it's definitely dividing Americans down partisan lines. I've talked about this before, where the catalyst for the party polarization that's happened in the last 2 decades really was social media. And it's because, yes, people get more informed, but at the same time, it's definitely more biased online. So it becomes more partisan. And I'm sure you guys have seen that. Here's an example of a way. This is a perfect example of a way how the media try to entertain rather than actually talk about policy objectives and stuff like that. So this was in 2016 when President Trump was was a candidate at the time. And instead of like sitting down and talking about the issues, they basically said, hey, is that really your hair? And that's really, ooh, yeah, that's important for becoming president of the United States. So basically, that's it for the media. What you basically saw, the overall summary of all of this is, number one, the media comes in many different forms. It comes in broadcast, it comes in print, it comes in social. Number two, the media outlets have consolidated, so there's fewer choices when it comes to who you get your news from, when it comes to especially broadcast media and print media. And then number three, there is bias in the news, especially online.